My name is Daniel Cole. I'm 48 years old, and for most of my life, I've kept my head down, worked hard, and stayed out of the spotlight. I built a career that didn't need fancy titles or loud recognition, the kind of job most people overlook until something goes wrong. I've been a security consultant for over 2 decades, handling high-profile clients and sensitive operations that never make the news unless they go catastrophically wrong. My work isn't glamorous, but it's dangerous, precise, and it requires a level of trust that very few people in this world ever get to experience. The night my father's words cut through me like glass, I was standing in the middle of my younger sister's wedding reception, smiling through a kind of quiet humiliation. The room was warm, filled with the scent of flowers and champagne, the hum of music, and the chatter of guests dressed in their best. My father, in his usual booming voice, had decided to introduce me to a table of his friends, people I didn't know, people I would likely never see again. He laughed, clapped me on the shoulder and said, "This is my son. He's just a security guard." Just, as if the word stripped me of every accomplishment, every life I'd protected, every night I'd spent awake making sure others could sleep in peace. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell the guests that my security guard work involved orchestrating multi-million-dollar protective details, negotiating with hostile entities, or tracking dangerous threats before they reached their targets. I didn't mention that I'd been flown overseas on missions I couldn't talk about, or that my clients included people whose names could start wars if spoken in the wrong tone. I just smiled, nodded, and let them think whatever they wanted, because in that moment I realized something. People who underestimate you give you the greatest power you can have, invisibility. But then it happened. One of the guests, a younger guy in his 30s, glanced at his phone mid-conversation. His eyes widened. He looked at me, then back at the screen, and then he blurted it out, loud enough for the entire table and my father to hear. "Holy shit, he's on the news." His voice cut through the music like a siren. The room didn't go silent, but it shifted, heads turned, conversations stumbled, and my father's champagne glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the marble floor. He had no idea, none of them did. They didn't know that while they were sipping champagne and dancing, I'd just come off a month-long operation that had made national headlines. My face had been on the news that morning, though the anchor never said my name, only referred to me as the private security expert who had helped dismantle an international smuggling ring. It was the kind of story most people would scroll past, unless they understood how dangerous those criminals were. In that split second, I saw the confusion on my father's face harden into something else, a mix of embarrassment and shock. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out, and I realized at this moment, this tiny crack in his perception of me was the beginning of something much bigger. He had spent years quietly belittling what I did, dismissing it as unimportant, but now the truth was out, and there was no going back. I've always believed loyalty isn't about what you say when someone is watching. It's about the quiet things you do when no one will ever know. For years I had protected people who would never thank me, who didn't even know my name. And I did it without expectation. That same philosophy had applied to my own family. I never asked them to understand the risks I took. I never pushed them to admire what I did. I thought my silence was humility. But that night, standing in the warm glow of wedding lights while my father struggled to process who I really was, I realized my silence had also given him permission to write my story for me. He had never been an unkind man, but he had a way of measuring worth in titles, in salaries, in things you could brag about over cocktails. And I never fit that mold. When my sister became a lawyer, he introduced her to everyone as the brilliant attorney. When my brother-in-law made partner at his firm, he was the financial genius. Me, I was Dan. He worked security, as if my life's work was holding a flashlight in a parking lot. The truth is, I had ignored the signs for years. Little comments at family dinners about real careers or jobs that build futures, jokes about my uniform, about how I must get bored sitting around all day. I told myself they didn't matter, that I was above caring about such things. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had been letting my own family treat me like I was invisible. And maybe that was fine when my career thrived quietly in the shadows. But the moment the world began to see me differently, I couldn't shake the question, why didn't they? I didn't need their approval, that much I knew. But the sting wasn't about needing validation. It was about realizing they never even tried to understand me. My father, the man who taught me to work hard and never quit, had reduced my life's work to a punchline in front of strangers, and the worst part, he probably thought it was harmless. After the incident at the wedding table, I avoided him for the rest of the night. I smiled when people asked questions, gave polite short answers, and let the curiosity build. By the time the cake was cut, whispers had started to circulate. A few guests approached me cautiously, their eyes scanning me like I was someone they couldn't quite place. My father kept glancing over at me, the way you might look at a photograph you suddenly realize you've misunderstood your whole life. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't correct him. Not then. Not in front of anyone. The truth had a way of revealing itself, and when it did, it was always more powerful if you let people uncover it on their own. I didn't want to humiliate him. I didn't want to argue. I wanted something far quieter and far more lasting. In the days after the wedding, I went back to work as if nothing had happened. My father didn't call, and I didn't reach out either. That suited me just fine. Silence is a powerful thing. It makes people uncomfortable, makes them fill the gaps with their own questions, and in those gaps, doubt begins to grow. I wanted him to sit with that uncertainty, to wonder if maybe for the first time he had been wrong about me. I didn't need to convince him with words. I had something stronger, the truth and the patience to let it breathe. At my job, things had shifted. The operation I'd been part of before the wedding had drawn attention from people I normally only dealt with through intermediaries. My role had been understated publicly, but in my world, it hadn't gone unnoticed. I was suddenly getting calls from contacts I hadn't spoken to in years, requests for private consultations, even offers from agencies that usually stayed off the record. All of this I kept to myself. The less my family knew, the better. Not because I wanted to hide, but because secrecy was leverage. It wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. I had no interest in humiliating my father or making a scene. What I wanted was a shift, a permanent change in how he saw me, one that couldn't be undone by an apology or a half-hearted compliment. The kind of change that comes when someone realizes they've been underestimating you for years and suddenly can't see you the same way again. That's the thing about respect. It's most powerful when it's earned in silence. I started laying the groundwork without even telling him. I accepted a contract that would take me into the public eye again, though not in a flashy way. This time, I'd be consulting for a high-profile investigation with a law enforcement task force, the kind of work that would inevitably find its way into the news cycle. Wasn't doing it for the headlines. I'd done enough in my career to know that attention comes and goes. But I also knew that when the right people start talking about you, the ripples reach farther than you'd expect. Meanwhile, I kept my conversations with my father minimal but cordial. When we did speak, I mentioned small, innocuous details about my schedule, working late this week, flying out for a client, never enough for him to piece anything together, but enough to remind him that my work didn't fit the tidy, dismissive box he'd built for it. Each time, I could sense his curiosity tightening, his questions growing more careful. In the past, I might have felt compelled to explain myself, to fill those silences with stories or proof. But not anymore. I had learned something important. When someone underestimates you, the most satisfying response isn't to fight for their recognition. It's to let them watch, helplessly, as the truth unfolds on its own terms. And I was just getting started. A few months later, the contract I'd taken was in full swing. It was grueling work. Long nights, constant strategy sessions, and layers of secrecy that even most of the task force didn't fully understand. But I'd been in this world long enough to know that the real results didn't just happen in courtrooms or headlines. They happened in the small, quiet victories no one else could see. This time, though, there would be headlines. That was inevitable, and I didn't need to chase them. The story would find me. The investigation broke open faster than anyone expected. A coordinated sweep led to dozens of arrests, and the operation we dismantled was bigger than even the lead detectives had anticipated. Within hours, the news cycle was filled with images from the raids, black SUVs, tactical teams, evidence being wheeled out in sealed containers. My name wasn't plastered across the screen, but the footage lingered just long enough for anyone paying attention to notice the tall man in the background, directing movements with an earpiece and a steady hand. That was all it took. The calls started almost immediately. Old friends, colleagues, and even a few distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years reached out. They'd seen me. They'd read between the lines. My father didn't call, not at first, but word travels fast in families, and I knew it was only a matter of time before someone mentioned it to him. I imagined the conversation, his hesitant nod, the half-smile he wore when trying to mask surprise, the slow realization that the son he'd labeled just a security guard was the same man standing in the middle of a federal sting operation. When he finally did call, his voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pride, either. It was something closer to discomfort. He asked me casually how work was going. I answered in the same calm, measured tone I'd always used. Busy, I said, but good. He wanted more. I could hear it in the pauses, in the way he cleared his throat before moving on to small talk. But I didn't give him anything. If he wanted the full picture, he'd have to seek it himself. The next week, he invited me to dinner. That alone told me the shift had begun. My father didn't extend invitations lightly. At the table, he danced around the topic of my work, mentioning seeing some things without specifying what. I just listened, nodded, and let the silence stretch. He was used to having control of the narrative, to defining me before I had the chance to speak. But now, for the first time, he was on the outside looking in. I left that dinner knowing something had changed. Not in what he said, but in what he didn't. He hadn't made a single joke about my job. He hadn't tried to minimize it. And when I walked away, I caught him watching me with a look I couldn't quite read. It wasn't admiration. Not yet, but it was no longer dismissal. And that was enough to keep me moving toward the final turn of the blade. The final blow didn't come from me. It never does, when you plan it right. It came from the world doing what it does best, talking. The operation I'd been part of had expanded into an international case, and the media was running follow-ups to keep the story alive. This time, a journalist managed to get an inside interview. They didn't name me directly, but they described my role in detail, down to the fact that I was a private security strategist who'd been called in because of previous successful dismantling of high-risk criminal networks. It was vague enough to protect my anonymity, but precise enough that anyone who knew me couldn't mistake it. I didn't send the article to my father. I didn't have to. Within a day, my phone lit up with messages from cousins, old neighbors, and even one of his longtime friends who thought it would be good for him to see this. I could picture the scene perfectly. Him sitting in his leather chair, glasses halfway down his nose, reading the words over and over, and somewhere between the lines, realizing the truth had been there all along. The next family gathering was where it all unraveled for him. I arrived quietly. No fanfare, no announcement. But the moment I stepped through the door, conversation shifted. People turned. A few of my relatives approached me with questions, genuine curiosity in their eyes. I answered them politely, never giving too much away, but enough to keep their interest. My father stood off to the side, watching, saying nothing. It was the first time I'd ever seen him silent in a room full of people who were looking to him for a cue. At some point, one of his friends, the same type he'd once introduced me to as just a security guard, leaned over to him and said something I couldn't hear, but I saw his face. I saw the way his jaw tightened, the way he glanced at me like he was seeing a stranger, and then came the moment that would seal it forever. One of the younger guests, phone in hand, looked between me and the screen before blurting out, "Wait, you're the guy from the news, right?" The room froze for half a second, and in that silence my father's hand slipped. His champagne glass hit the floor. The sound sharp and clean. No one laughed. No one moved. He didn't pick it up. He just stood there, caught between the version of me he'd always believed in and the one standing right in front of him. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I just bent down, picked up the largest shard of glass, set it on the table beside him. "Careful," I said quietly. "It's sharp." And then I walked away, leaving him in a room full of people who now knew more about me than he ever had. The glass incident became a turning point, not just for me, but for the dynamic between my father and me. From that day forward, he stopped trying to define me in conversations. He no longer introduced me with a casual shrug or a dismissive, "He works security." In fact, he rarely mentioned my job at all. At first, I thought it was avoidance, that maybe he simply didn't want to risk another public misstep. But as the weeks went on, I realized it was something deeper. He was recalibrating. For years, he'd been comfortable knowing where I stood in his mental hierarchy. He had his lawyer daughter, his financially successful in-laws, and then there was me, the quiet son in a uniform. But now that he knew the truth, the neat order he'd built had collapsed. And the thing about people like my father is, once they lose control of a narrative, they can't get it back. Every time he looked at me, I could see him measuring the gap between what he thought he knew and what he now suspected. I didn't use my new leverage to humiliate him. I didn't bring up the wedding or the introductions or a glass shattering at his feet. I didn't need to. My silence spoke louder than anything I could have said. The more I said nothing, the more others filled in the blanks for him. Family friends would ask about Daniel's big case or that international work in his presence, and he would nod along, smiling faintly, as if he'd known it all along. The power had shifted completely, and I hadn't raised my voice once. That's the beauty of silent revenge. It doesn't announce itself. It just lets the other person wake up one day and realize they've been standing on the wrong side of the truth for years. And once that realization sets in, it doesn't leave. It lingers. Professionally, things kept accelerating. The task force work opened doors to projects I'd once thought I'd left behind, higher-risk operations, advisory roles for international security firms, and even a discreet invitation to lecture at a private intelligence summit. I accepted only what interested me. The rest, I turned down without explanation. When you control your time, you control the game. My father caught wind of some of this, though never from me directly. He'd hear it from others, in pieces. A colleague who saw my name on a guest list, an old friend who heard about the summit. It wasn't just that he knew more now, it was that he knew he didn't know everything. That uncertainty gave me more leverage than any direct confrontation ever could. I began to notice changes in his behavior. At family gatherings, he sought me out earlier. He listened more than he spoke. And once, over coffee, he asked, carefully, almost awkwardly, "You ever think of writing a book?" I knew what he was really asking. Could I give him the whole story? Could I let him back in? But I wasn't ready to do that. Not yet, because the truth is, the power wasn't in telling him everything. The power was in letting him live with the mystery, in the same way he'd once underestimated me without thinking twice. He now overestimated me without knowing for sure, and in both cases, it was his own mind doing the work. 6 months later, a rare invitation came. Not from my father, but from my mother. She wanted to host a small dinner for the family. Nothing extravagant, just a chance to all be together. I knew what it was. A carefully staged moment for my father to reclaim some of his footing. He'd never admit it, but I suspected he wanted to be the one to bring me into the fold, this time, to present me to others on his terms. The night arrived, and I played along. I showed up early, dressed simply, without any of the trappings that might suggest status. My work had taught me that the most powerful people in the room are rarely the ones dressed to announce it. We sat, we ate, we talked about unimportant things, and then, halfway through dessert, my father cleared his throat and began telling a story about a situation overseas that I had helped with. It was vague, clumsy, and clearly second-hand, but there was something in his tone that I'd never heard before: respect. For years I had imagined what it would feel like to finally earn that. I thought it would be loud, celebratory, obvious. Instead, it was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was real, and in that quiet moment, I realized something important. I didn't need to win by proving him wrong in front of everyone. I'd already won by changing the way he saw me, without ever demanding it. Looking back, I think my father's greatest miscalculation was assuming that because I didn't seek attention, I didn't have influence. The truth is, influence grows best in the shadows. My world operates on confidentiality, discretion, and trust. The more invisible you are, the more you can move freely, and the more impact you can have without resistance. In the months that followed, I was offered a position that would take me into an advisory role for one of the largest private security firms in the world. It wasn't a role with a public title or flashy salary announcements. But the people who needed to know knew, and that was enough. I accepted without hesitation. When I told my father, I kept it brief. "I'm taking a new position," I said over the phone. "It's good for me." He paused for a long moment before replying, "I'm proud of you, son." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accompanied by an apology for the years of dismissal, but it was the first time he'd ever said those words without it sounding like an afterthought, and that, more than anything, told me the shift was complete. There's a certain satisfaction in knowing you've changed someone's perception without forcing them into it. No arguments, no ultimatums, just the slow, steady weight of reality pressing in until they can't deny it anymore. My father and I will never be the type to sit and unpack our feelings. We speak in actions, in moments. And in his own way, he's been making amends ever since. Small gestures, careful words, a quiet respect that wasn't there before. I've learned that revenge doesn't have to be cruel to be effective. It doesn't have to be loud to be satisfying. Sometimes the sweetest justice is letting the truth reveal itself while you carry on with your life, untouched. Because in the end, it's not about making them see what you've done, it's about making them realize they never truly saw you at all. And now, when I walk into a room, I don't need my father to introduce me. I don't need anyone to. People know, and for those who don't, I'm fine with remaining a mystery. Because invisibility is no longer a burden, it's my greatest strength.